Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. We might get started. I think get started right now. So kia ora koutou. My name is Jessica Pallaret, and I'm Executive Director at Lawyers for Climate Action. And I'm thrilled to join you this morning for this Lawyers for Climate Action webinar, along with Deborah Dorrington, one of our wonderful board members and volunteers who has taken the lead on this. Deborah and I came up with the idea to hold this webinar really in the wake of Donald Trump's election in the US and the ESG climate law policy rollbacks that shortly ensued. And I think as someone that cares about seeing action on climate change, it's felt like a pretty dispiriting year. But we know that climate change is happening. We need to transition our economy to a low emissions one. And the question is, what's the role that we can play as the legal profession in that transition? And this is where the concept of climate conscious lawyering comes in, which is the topic of today's session. The concept of climate conscious lawyering really had its zeitgeist moment a couple of years ago, and I think has fallen away from public discussion a little bit. But I think it's time that we bring it back. The idea is that we as lawyers need to have the requisite and relevant skills and expertise and competencies in climate so that we're able to give our advice in light of those. And that the idea is the legal profession and our role as lawyers, we actually have a role to play in the transition and in the solution to the climate crisis. And so the purpose of today's webinar is to reassess that concept in 2025 and do so alongside some fantastic experts we have joining us from the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, from the International Bar Association, from the New Zealand Law Society. And hopefully you're able to leave this session feeling like you've been equipped with new resources and knowledge and inspiration to take you forward into your day and into the rest of your career. Before I pass on to Deborah, I am going to give a short plug for Lawyers for Climate Action membership. If you are not already a member, I'd highly encourage you to do so and become one. You can sign up just on our website, and it's no strings attached. But if you support what we do, just webinars like this, which you get free access to, but also we bring strategic climate litigation, engage in law and policy reform. If you support that, or if you want to be a part of it, I'd encourage you to join our growing community of over 350 lawyers from across the country. The more members we have, the stronger we are as an organisation. So I encourage everyone to sign up. Without further ado, I'd love to pass over to Deborah to introduce our panelists and get this thing going.
Thank you so much, Jess. And good morning to you all. No, my haere mai from Rotorua here. We're after a couple of days of pretty tumultuous weather. It's a beautiful day, and I can see the lake glistening. There's some clouds high in a blue sky, and it's a really lovely start. And I want to make a special mention, though, to those of you perhaps further south and further north who've been doing a bit hard weather-wise. I hope that things are improving, that you're safe, and that you've got better weather arriving. It's a timely reminder, hey, to be talking about weather with this topic of climate conscious lawyering. Welcome to all of you this morning from across the motu and from further afield. To tell you a little bit about the timing of today, we're going to hear from our first speaker, Emily, for about 20 minutes, Lara for 20 minutes, and then there'll be 20 minutes left where we'll hear some from Bronwyn from the New Zealand Law Society and a time for questions. There will be hopefully plenty of time to answer questions. But rather than answer them throughout, we'll deal with them all at the end. Do submit them, though, in the usual way, and we'll gather them up and deal with them at the end. We'll finish this at 10 o'clock, and then you can get on with your day. So our first speaker is Emily Morison, and Emily is, well, both Emily and Lara are joining us from the Northern Hemisphere, from London, where it's about the time you should be sitting down on the couch with a cup of tea rather than getting ready to talk to a crowd. So welcome. It's absolutely lovely to have you here, the pair of you. Emily is coming to us from the International Bar Association. She's a lawyer, but a lawyer with a science degree, as well as a number of legal degrees, but a science degree as well, and lots of experience in private practice and otherwise in dealing with decarbonisation, environmental and planning law, assessing and managing nature-related risks and the like. She's part of the Legal Policy and Research Unit of the International Bar Association, and she leads projects in environment, climate, and business and human right law, and is the delegate lead for the UNFCCC and COP engagement. Emily, welcome. It's an absolute delight to have you. And I'm going to turn my mic on, and please turn yours on. Turn mine off, I mean.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. And as an Australian, it's lovely to be connecting with colleagues close to home. So thank you very much to Jessica, to Deborah and to Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand for having me today. I'll just spend a few moments talking about the IBA's journey with respect to engaging with the role of the legal profession around climate change issues. And then I'll provide my thoughts on the ongoing importance of climate conscious thinking for lawyers in uncertain political times that we're dealing with at the moment. And I will say that those are my views and don't necessarily represent the views of the IBA. As Deborah kindly mentioned, my name's Emily. I'm a project lawyer in the IBA's Legal Policy and Research Unit. But before joining the IBA, where I'm based in London, I worked in commercial practice in environment, climate change, and sustainability in a number of Australian law firms. And I'll speak to that a little bit more later on. To give you a bit of a flavour of what the IBA is all about, for those of you who might not be familiar with the IBA, we're the world's leading organisation of legal practitioners, bar associations, law firms, and also law societies. And among other things, the principal aims of the IBA include protecting and enhancing the rule of law and promoting information sharing among our members on the laws, the practices, and the professional responsibilities that affect the legal profession across jurisdictions. Today, the IBA's membership includes about 80,000 individual lawyers, around 300 law firms, and almost 200 bar associations and law societies as well. My role specifically, as Deborah mentioned, is all around supporting initiatives that relate to the role of the legal profession in responding to climate change and business and human rights and broader sustainability issues. Specifically, I work to support initiatives that bring together lawyers and bar associations from across jurisdictions to explore what climate conscious or climate competent lawyering looks like in legal practice, how bar associations can educate and support their lawyers when advising on climate change. And I also do quite a bit of work around convening educational sessions, a little bit like this one, on key climate and sustainability related legal topics. To give you a sense of the IBA's engagement to this point on climate change and related issues, the IBA has been actively engaged with respect to the role of the legal profession in responding to climate change for over a decade. And it really all kicked off with the release of a report by a climate change task force assembled within the IBA, which was all around achieving justice and human rights in the era of climate disruption. And that was back in 2014. But since then, the IBA has published a model statute for proceedings challenging government failure to act on climate change. And more recently, 5 years ago now, so pre-COVID, the IBA published a climate crisis statement, which is essentially setting out the IBA's position on the role of the legal profession in responding to climate change. And that statement's a really important one. It notes the consensus within the scientific community that climate change represents an urgent and potentially irreversible threat to humanity and life on the planet. It recognises that lawyers have an important role to play in addressing the climate crisis and its consequences, and it urges lawyers acting in accordance with their professional conduct rules and the rule of law to consider taking a climate-conscious approach to problems encountered in daily legal practice, and Jessica described beautifully what that's all about earlier on. Advising clients of the potential risks, liability, and reputational damage arising from activity that negatively contributes to the climate crisis. Encouraging our business clients to disclose the risks posed by climate change to that corporation's entire business operation and their supply chains, in their communications to regulators, investors, and stakeholders, and also engaging in climate-related dispute resolution. And this year, just to provide a little bit of an update on that, We're recognising that there's a need to support a review and a potential update of that climate crisis statement in light of the significant regulatory and litigation developments, the increasing recognition of the linkages between climate and biodiversity and human rights challenges, and all of these things that have evolved in the 5 years since that statement was issued, as well as the significant action taken by bar associations and law societies around climate change in that period of time. So please watch that space because it's a really exciting piece of work. And the other aspect of the IBA's work that I wanted to touch upon is our work to support the climate initiatives of bar associations and law societies. Last year, and this is all thanks to my predecessor, Lara, who will speak to you in a moment, the IBA launched what's called the IBA Climate Crisis Registry, which is essentially a platform for bars to share the actions that they're taking to address climate change at an operational level and through their engagement with members. So far, that registry has received contributions from all across the globe, so I encourage you to take a look at that. And earlier this year, we convened a roundtable that brought together almost 50 bar association leaders to discuss the challenges, the opportunities, and the good practices that they're learning about from their experiences of formulating and implementing climate initiatives in their jurisdictions. And Alex, I might trouble you to bring up that slide just so that the QR codes to those resources are available in case you'd like to read some more. What was really inspiring to me from that roundtable that we convened was the fact that, yes, we're in a time of geopolitical uncertainty, regulatory rollbacks, as Deborah and Jessica mentioned, but there's clearly a very strong sense of momentum for progressing climate change among bar associations, and that was across the range of jurisdictions that we engaged in that roundtable. So please do take a look at that report when you can. To give you a sense of some of the activities that we heard from bar associations in terms of their climate engagement, that ranged from developing educational programs to better equip lawyers and judges to navigate the complexities of climate change in legal advice, developing guidance for practitioners on how climate change interacts with their professional duties of care, their obligations to provide competent legal advice, and their requirements to warn about risks, among other things. And we also saw some other bars who are specifically developing guidance that touches on practice areas and their intersections with climate risk, and conveyancing practice and associated climate physical risks is a key example of that. We also heard from bars who are engaging in policy advocacy and law reform processes, measuring and reducing their own organisation's operational climate impacts, and supporting law firms to implement sustainable business practices. I'll stop there and I'll stop talking about the IBA's work at this point, and hone into what this webinar is really all about, which is what does it mean to be a climate conscious lawyer in the midst of political turbulence that we're seeing at the moment. As Jessica's already touched on, the intersections between the legal profession and climate change are multidimensional. And I've mentioned that we've seen bar associations release specific guidance around how climate change interacts with our professional responsibilities and our ethical requirements as lawyers. I think, in my view, and coming from commercial practice, I think that understanding evolving climate change physical and transition risks and how our national and international legal frameworks and our policies respond to those risks really just empowers us as lawyers to provide holistic and thorough advice to our clients and to really add value. And that's a view that I will continue to hold despite what we're currently seeing across some jurisdictions at the moment. And of course, I must admit that when I was in private practice in Australia a few years ago, it was very easy to draw that line between climate conscious lawyering and practice, because we were seeing legislation, regulatory action, and litigation all pointing very strongly in the direction of decarbonisation and broader mitigation priorities. So to give you an example of the kinds of developments that we were seeing in Australia, we were seeing climate financial risk reporting legislation being developed. There were consultations underway in respect of a potential carbon border adjustment mechanism. There were reforms to our emissions cap legislation for large industrial emitters that significantly ticked up their regulatory obligations. We're also seeing changes and reviews to our national carbon markets framework. We had very active financial and competition and consumer regulators actively enforcing anti-greenwashing laws against a whole suite of corporations. And we were seeing a real rise in climate litigation across the jurisdiction, both against government and corporations. And in parallel with all of that, there was that development of the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And we knew that those were going to have significant implications for non-EU companies, including many that were based in Australia. So it was very easy to be a climate change lawyer in that context. But of course, today we're undeniably seeing some jurisdictions that are moving in a direction toward deregulation, and we're even seeing some litigation that's challenging climate initiatives as opposed to the other way around. But I have a few points that I want to share in light of that. And the first thing that I would like to emphasize is that it's not happening everywhere. We're definitely still seeing laws regulating climate change push forward in a number of jurisdictions. And I point, for example, to a number of jurisdictions who've recently finished their consultations on sustainability reporting disclosure requirements aligned with the ISSB. I also wanted to emphasize that physical risks associated with climate change don't go away when regulations change. They only escalate. And I think that there's a huge role for lawyers to play in helping clients to maintain an understanding of these risks and to sort of push through some of the noise that we're seeing at the moment to recognize that the physical risks associated with climate change can only become more important rather than less. I also want to highlight that climate litigation risk is certainly not going anywhere either. It continues to increase globally with an overall focus on challenging failures to mitigate or adapt to climate change. And I'm sure a number of you on this call will be aware of the Grantham Research Institute's work to capture global trends in climate litigation each year. And reading through that report, cases continue to be filed against corporations and an increasing number of sectors and in relation to a broader array of activities than simply direct fossil fuel production and combustion, and are also increasingly integrating human rights arguments. So there's a lot going on in that space, and I think there's a huge role for lawyers to be playing in making sure that their clients are aware of those climate-related litigation risks and how they can be mitigating any liability risk that might apply for them accordingly. The other point that I wanted to make, I've touched on the fact that physical risks aren't going anywhere. Climate change impacts and responses really do give rise to a range of those longer term physical and transition risks that I think challenge us as lawyers to think a bit beyond that immediate term compliance requirement. For example, when we're advising on those long-term investment decisions, those big M&A deals, those large-scale infrastructure or renewable energy or resource projects, we need to be thinking much bigger picture and much longer term in terms of what the legal landscape from a regulatory perspective will be looking like in 5, 10, 20 years' time, as opposed to just the immediate trends that we're seeing currently. And that's in addition to those climate physical risks that you need to be thinking about whenever you're engaging in a long-term investment transaction or developing a big project. And so I do think that, and perhaps this is a wrong view, but I think personally, based on history that we've seen in this trend toward regulation in the climate space over the past 10 years and beyond, I do tend to the view that we're going to, in the longer term, continue to see that. And some of the decisions that come out of the UNFCCC COPs, for example, at each year, point in the direction toward decarbonisation and importance of climate resilience, climate mitigation activity. And so I think there's a really important role for lawyers to be playing in zooming out and thinking to those longer term trends and helping to guide their clients on that journey accordingly. And sorry, you can lose that slide. I'm sorry, Alex, I should have noted that earlier. That can go. Thank you. The other thing that I do want to touch on before I finish up, because I want to hear Lara's excellent comments, but there are important links between the impacts of climate change and human rights, and these aren't going away either. They only escalate as physical risks escalate as well. So I think there's a really big role for lawyers to be playing in advising on good business human rights practice so that businesses can help to align their practice with the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And in that regard, I do note that the IBA has released business and human rights guidance for lawyers that I encourage you to take a look at, because it does touch on those intersections between climate and human rights considerations. So to finish up and hand over to Deborah and then on to Lara, it's certainly a difficult time for the legal profession, and I think more generally for anyone who cares about climate change, as we're seeing some deregulation and pushback in this space. But I also firmly believe that it's a really critical opportunity for lawyers to take this as a time to support their clients to navigate those uncertainties in a positive way. I attended an interesting webinar last week that talked about how when we don't have so much to say around regulatory compliance, principle-based advice and looking at the values that guide companies and to help them navigate risk accordingly is a really important thing to bear in mind. And I certainly agree with that view. In the interest of time, Deborah, I'll stop it there, but really look forward to questions. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much. That's really inspiring stuff to get started. It's so often we operate as a lone voice, really, in trying to raise some of these issues, often in quite stressful times of negotiations or timeframes that are put on lawyers. And it's inspiring to be recognised about the continued importance of climate conscious lawyering, to be reminded, I guess, that climate change doesn't care about changes in policy, changes in legislation, and what's going on. So yeah, a brilliant reminder there. And I agree with your comment too about the need to zoom out and to look at things at a broader perspective, looking at transitional changes, the changes in the way that organisations and individuals and starting to look at the requirements that are coming up longer term. I didn't express that very well. You did a much better job. Thank you, Em. It was lovely to have you speaking. Hey, we'll move on now.
Deborah.
What's that? Yeah. We'll move on now to Lara. So thank you so much, Lara. This is Lara Douvartzidis, who is joining us also from London. Also should be sitting on the couch with a cup of tea. Lara is at the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, which is an alliance established to mobilise commercial law firms, lawyers, and the law to accelerate the transition to net zero. So Lara too has got extensive experience in environmental law and disputes and business and human rights law, both in private practice and legal policy, including, as you heard briefly, working at the International Bar Association, doing a similar role, or perhaps even the same role that Emily is doing before Emily's arrival. Lara's led delegations to COP27 and COP28. She serves as an officer of the IBA Business and Human Rights Committee and is an associate fellow of the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law. Welcome, Lara, and I will turn my audio off.
Well, thank you, everyone, and tēnā kutu. Hello, I'm actually dialing in from the northeast of Scotland, so nearly spring, but the weather seems a bit confused, although that's probably to be expected with where the science of climate change is at. So before I get started, I just wanted to thank you, Deborah, and the whole team at Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand for convening us today. And to my fellow panelists, Emily and Bronwyn, it's great to be together again. And for all of you who are listening, please feel free to start asking some questions, because we'll definitely have some time at the end. If I could go next slide, please. Today, I'll be walking through, albeit very briefly, the relevance of climate change for us lawyers. I'll step through what my organization is all about, and then I'll go through some of our key documents and resources built for lawyers by lawyers, and then leave you with a few takeaways, and we can get into the questions after we've heard from Bronwyn. Next slide, please. Anova one next. Thank you. No doubt you're here in part because you are interested in this topic, and you may have read up a bit or a lot about how the law is connected to climate change. And just to get you thinking a bit, this is by no means an exhaustive list of how it's all connected, but certainly there are 4 things I wanted to point out. First is the scientific consensus. We know that the main drivers of climate change are activities like burning fossil fuels and things like deforestation. So understanding these causes is essential for creating effective emission regulations, energy policies, but also for good lawyering. I was trained as an environment and planning lawyer, and if there are other E&P lawyers listening on this call, I suspect similar to in Australia, there may have been cases that hinged on climate attribution science or a carbon budget approach. So this will be no stranger to you. The second is rising legal risks. Climate change increases legal risks as it increases transition and physical risks. So these relate to property, corporate liability, insurance, environmental regulations, including greenwashing, to name a few. And it goes to what Em was talking about those physical and transition risks. And what I'd ask you to look at is, what are your insurers looking at? What does your personal indemnity insurance cover these days? What are actuaries saying? Because if you look at that, you get a pretty good idea quite quickly as to how serious they're taking this issue. The third is international obligations, something that sits above us all, the Paris Agreement. It aims to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. This influences legal obligations in all areas and informs domestic laws and legal challenges, which you would be very familiar with. And I'll go through in the next slide. But just to say, these targets are grounded by countries' nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And I've been at a number of events where our commercial lawyers talk about NDCs as an opportunity. It's a bit of a shopping list for lawyers on all of the legal and regulatory change that needs to happen to enable the transition, to enable mitigation and adaptation on the road to net zero. So if you've not read your country's NDC, it was uploaded a few months ago, and I'd highly recommend it. The fourth is professional competence. So lawyers, if you have signed the role and you are practicing, we have an obligation to act competently. And I'm sure we'll hear more from Bronwyn at the Law Society about that. But generally, that includes being informed about developments, about science, and about how that science is influencing the law, and to provide informed legal advice and fulfill our legal duty of care to the court, but also to our clients. And Em walked through what different bars and law societies are saying about that. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, because I acknowledge that it's an Australian talking to New Zealanders about Aotearoa's commitments. I acknowledge that, but just to get us all on the same page, there's domestic obligations and international obligations. And as I said, the international informs the domestic, but for the domestic, the Climate Change Response Act is a real grounder. When I saw it was dated from 2002, my first thought was, wow, early movers. But I've come to understand that a new wing of that act was added in 2019. But just to say, New Zealand has a 2050 target for all greenhouse gas emissions except biogenic methane. You have emission budgets with 5-year interim targets, emission reduction plans, and then a regular cycle of national climate change risk assessment, as well as the Climate Change Commission. If this isn't a go-to knowledge for you, I'd encourage it to be so, because it's good to be informed about our regulatory regime. If we could go next slide, please. Thank you. And just to say, for that international obligation, the current NDC for Aotearoa is to reduce net emissions to 50% below gross 2005 levels by 2030. Next slide, sorry. We're international. Perfect. Thank you. And only a few months ago did New Zealand issue their second NDC, which is to reduce net emissions to 51 to 55%. Now, that increase is there, but it's nominal. And like many countries, including my own, the Climate Action Tracker records that progress as highly insufficient, although that rating was from 2023. But certainly, you know, it's progress. And we would hope with NDCs, the legal obligation is to always ratchet up. So we're expecting it to increase even more. But that increase won't come for another few years yet. But nevertheless, lawyers play a huge role, well, not huge, but certainly key in the Conference of Parties, which is the annual meeting of all nations that have signed the Paris Agreement under the UNFCCC. And lawyers are there to advise governments on these international obligations. And I can go through that in a bit more detail. But if we could go to the next slide. So what is the NZLA? Who are we? What do we do? As Deborah alluded to, we were established ahead of COP26, which was the Glasgow COP in 2021, to mobilise commercial law firms, lawyers, and the law to accelerate the transition to net zero. So since then, we've assisted commercial law firms around the world to help their clients reduce their emissions and build climate resilience in supporting the global transition. So today, our membership includes around 40 members, encompassing over 100,000 lawyers across more than 40 jurisdictions. We are committed to leveraging the collective expertise of our membership to provide net zero aligned legal services and aligned commercial law as best possible with net zero in a systemic way. If we could go next slide, please. And so our North Star at NZLA really is the acknowledgement that the law can and must enable a just and equitable transition, not just transition, and that legal frameworks, products, and services are critical to aligning finance flows consistent with net zero. And the wording of finance flows comes from the Paris Agreement itself. Article 2.1c calls for that consistency in finance flows. So it's very much tied to that international statute. If we could go to the next slide, please. To have an idea of like who's who in the zoo, who's who in our membership, it comprises both national firms and international firms. So across the Asia Pacific, where we're all at, we have a number of national firms, including Shinwa Law in Japan, Chapman Tripp in New Zealand. What have we got? BTG Advaya in India. And then also Nusantara in Indonesia. But we also have a number of international firms, which you can see on that list, that have offices across major cities in APAC, including New Zealand and my home, Australia. So all that's to say we have one national firm from New Zealand, but of course we would love to have some more. Next slide, please. So when firms join the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, they join a global network of commercial firms and of people, of individual lawyers, and teams that support lawyers, because of course, you know, at a commercial firm, certainly the bigger that they get, lawyers are just one part of the whole team that keeps the place going. You've got business development managers, sustainability operatives, support staff, you name it. So we help all of those categories understand how to accelerate the transition to net zero. And we do that through, firstly, the commitment, which is what the firms sign up to when they join us, then the capacity building, and finally the convert piece, which I'll walk through very quickly. Next slide, please. So the commitment itself is the gateway to the alliance, as I said. Next slide, please. It has a few key components. The first is emission reduction. We use 1.5 as the anchor of our commitment, again, tied to the Paris Agreement. And member firms must set net zero targets for 2050 or sooner, as well as interim targets for 2030. When firms sign up with us, of course, it's a journey to get to that stage. It sometimes takes years, and we're not expecting any miracles. What we do is we help firms get to that point. Some have now got those targets accredited with SBTI, but certainly it's a journey. They look to set capacity building targets, pro bono services as well, and net zero aligned legal advice. If we could go next slide, please. So on the capacity, we help prepare staff be part of that transition and also to help future-proof the business. So next slide, please. We do that through a number of explainers. We have a steering group meeting, which is every month. We help bring together experts for our membership on key and interesting topics like what's up with national carbon markets these days? Like, what is the omnibus process in the EU and why is it relevant for climate? If there's a climate negotiation, what's going on the ground? Chances are a few of our lawyers are there and can report live. So it's a real community, and I can go through the resources in a bit more detail, but I'll drop the links in the chat. And if you could go next slide, please. The third is the convert piece, which is how do we unlock barriers to the transition through legal solutions and enablers. Next slide, please. We have 4 active groups. I help lead 3 of them. That is in fiduciary duties, project finance, competition law, and business and human rights. And so I lead these groups. We have practitioners dialing in from firms across the world who have this in their expertise. We have a work program for each, and we work on projects to help identify those blockers and deliver solutions. So next slide, please. In May of last year, we helped deliver a significant tool, which is the framework for net zero alignment. So this was written by commercial lawyers for commercial lawyers to understand and provide guidance on the steps that those commercial firms can take to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions, manage firm climate-related risks, of which there are many, and unlock opportunities to facilitate the global transition to net zero. So in the framework, it recognises the unique skills and positioning of commercial lawyers to accelerate the transition in ways that go far beyond value chain mitigation. So if we could go next slide, please. So the guidance acknowledged that different firms are likely to be at different stages of implementing their net zero commitments. It's related to size, location, internal buy-in. There are many different reasons that firms sit on that scale. It's also likely that the awareness of and the readiness for the transition will vary within and between firms, and we see that all the time. So the framework accommodates each firm's unique starting point and assists members to achieve their climate ambitions. The framework responds to calls for clarity, certainty, and also an indication of what is best practice. So it builds on research and literature from the private sector, from NGOs and government departments. And the framework highlights, firstly, the importance and value of firms' net zero commitments and transition plans. This is our ambition section. Secondly, it enables firms to take logical, targeted steps to identify areas of climate-related transition risk and opportunity, helping equip firms to implement their commitments. So that's the action part. And third, last but not least, the framework ensures that firms adopt appropriate governance and reporting mechanisms to meet these commitments and monitor progress in a way that is healthy and would help you not fall foul of any greenwashing issues. And that's the accountability part. So these pillars, as I've laid out there, are mutually supportive of each other and should be implemented in parallel. While the framework is voluntary, the NZLA strongly recommends that our firms utilise this guidance because it helps get to where you want to be without reinventing the wheel. Like, we've done the work for the firms, and we've helped align practical steps to design these net zero commitments and implement them. And it helps firms navigate these critical challenges in clients' operating environments, helps answer the really sticky questions, and future-proof legal advice as firms transition along with their client base. So just to walk through a few key parts of that framework, if we could go next slide, please. Again, we talk about net zero aligned advice being aligned with 1.5, and that lawyers must be equipped to provide net zero aligned advice and help clients navigate these changes in whatever way is relevant to your clients. Next slide, please. We talk about interim targets and what that should look like. We explain the differences between scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but my EMP lawyers would be very familiar with those terms. So I won't go through them now, but certainly I'll drop the link in the chat for the framework and you can have a look. We talk about those targets being independently verified as and when, supported by appropriate monitoring and reporting, and a strategy that sits behind all of this that helps guide it all. Next slide, please. We also look to seize opportunities in various areas. Next slide as well, please. And capacity building across the whole firm. We see this consistently as one of the biggest challenges. And so we've developed a number of resources, which I'll quickly go through before we go to Bronwyn, about what that might look like. And finally, next slide, pro bono services. The NZLA, when you become a member, we often receive from NGOs like UN PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment, and other NGOs around the traps. They come to us seeking commercial pro bono help. We then help match that request with our member law firm. So we act as a bit of a clearinghouse, and we're happy to do that where we can. So that's the framework, and just quickly through the resources because I'm conscious of time. Next slide, please, and one more. We've developed a number of resources to help explain really big topics and concepts. We've got infographics that walk through the Paris Agreement, that walk through the science of climate change. So the latest IPCC report condenses thousands of pages into something more manageable. And if you're a visual learner like me, it's real joy to read because it helps unpack some really complicated concepts. We also have an explainer of what a successful climate law looks like, which helps you discern maybe what a not so ideal climate law looks like, as well as a traffic light system to help practitioners navigate competition law in the context of sustainability. And I know reading the news in New Zealand, competition law and sustainability, this is something at the fore. So if you're interested in that, of course, please let us know. Next slide, please. So here on the left, we have some different logos with different topics in climate change. This is from our Law and Climate Atlas, which is one of our most used resources. We did this in collaboration with the University of Cambridge. We help match different areas of law and how it relates to climate change. And we hear all the time, this is used in firms to help skill up legal and business development teams, but also get that buy-in from maybe the harder to reach lawyers that maybe are not understanding of how it all links together. Next slide, please. Some key terminology around meaning of carbon neutral, net zero, things like that. And next slide, please, finally, is that Paris Agreement explainer, but I'll link it all in the chat. If we could go to the takeaways dot points, please. One more. Thank you. So just to remember that lawyers are uniquely positioned to help clients. Resources do exist. Communities do exist. Please join us if you'd like. It's free. And just remember that commercial lawyers and lawyers generally, we are critical to this transition. So thanks again for having us. Final slide. I've dropped my email there, but if you have any questions, please let us know and we'll hop into question time with Bronwyn and everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lara, for showing us this enormous range of support and resources that are available. And I was interested right at the very beginning, you talked about, hey, look at insurance have a chat to your insurers about what's going on. And I often talk to practitioners about that, about look at your terms of engagement. Do your terms of engagement with your clients say anything about whether you're going to take into account climate changes or not? Because to be competent, they should. And if you don't want to do it, if they don't want to do it, you better get that as part of your terms of engagement. Thank you so much. We'll move straight away into hearing from Bronwyn. How lovely to have you here. Bronwyn has come at a last minute thing to tell us about something very exciting that's going on, and it's especially good because there's a board meeting going on at the moment, isn't there, that you're supposed to be part of, and instead you've opted to come and have a chat to us, so thank you so much. Bronwyn is the General Manager, Policy, Courts and Government at the New Zealand Law Society, and she leads a group that deals with high-level strategic advice and submissions, including on new products. So she's here because she's been intrinsically involved in quite an exciting development about the NZLS guidance on climate change management for lawyers. So I want to pass over straight away to Bronwyn to hear about what's been going on.
Ngā mihi o te ata kia koutou. Good morning, everybody. So I really do appreciate us being included in this webinar because I thought there were just a few things that might be useful to mention around what the Law Society has been doing in this space, because I think we've probably been a bit quieter than we should have, and we've got a few bits of publication coming out once we're ready with some of the big pieces of news we've got. So I thought the first thing I'd mention is that we do have a dedicated climate change law committee, and that's a law reform committee established by the Law Society in 2022, and that's just to review and comment on proposed legislation and other consultations. It's convened by Natasha Garvin, a partner at Bell Gully, and it's got a further 7 volunteer members with expertise in this area. Establishment of the committee really recognised the increased specialisation of this growing area of law and the fact that we needed to bring in specialist experts more broader than just the resource management area and property areas. So the committee contributes significantly to the Law Society's submissions on RMA reform, climate reporting and disclosure obligations, the fast track approvals legislation, and it's also assisted in developing the Law Society's own climate policy. So just a bit of a plug, which my law reform manager asked me to do. We're really grateful to all of our volunteers, and we're lucky to have so many people willing to make better law for New Zealand and all New Zealanders. We do have applications for membership of the committee opening around June, and so we encourage anyone interested in law reform to consider putting in an application. We also have roles on those committees for new practitioners, so please don't think that this volunteer work is something just for the most senior lawyers. So I thought I'd also mention our climate change policy. So following consultation with the profession in 2023, the Law Society is now in process of implementing its climate change policy. So our policy is modelled on similar policies of comparable law associations internationally, particularly the Law Society of England and Wales and the Law Council of Australia. So we think that introducing a climate change policy sits within our responsibilities to support the legal profession in their practice and really to fulfill their professional duties, as we've been talking a little bit about here today. And that includes their duty to uphold the rule of law. So what Deborah was hinting at is that we are currently drafting guidance for the profession. And it's going to be relevant to the New Zealand context, and we hope it's going to support lawyers with understanding how climate matters can impact their professional obligations and duties, and how it assists in terms of competently advising clients in relation to any legal transaction that might be relevant in the climate-related areas. Once again, this is heavily based on what's been done overseas, including the work of the Law Society of England and Wales, but we did need to make sure that we were getting it right for the New Zealand context. Now, also, I thought it'd be well worth mentioning that as part of implementing the climate change policy, the Law Society has signed up with Toitu. Now, I'm sure most people on this call will know Toitu, but Toitu helps and guides organisations on their climate and environmental journeys. Basically, we knew that if we weren't walking the talk and modelling what we'd like to see in others, then we'd be rightly open to criticism from our own lawyers. So we've started the accreditation process, and that does involve a significant piece of data collection and recording to first determine our initial carbon footprint baseline. The only other thing I thought I would just mention, just because it's really come up, and Emily and also mentioned it, is that within my portfolio actually also falls the international area. So the Law Society represents the legal profession in the international arena. We've got, we're a member of a number of several significant international law associations, and through those memberships, we support those facing challenges to the rule of law, engage on current and common issues, and we contribute to the development of international legal practice and policy. So we're actively engaged with the International Bar Association's climate change work, and as Emily mentioned, we are part of their roundtable on Bar Association and Law Society climate initiatives. So we're very pleased to be part of those great initiatives from the International Bar Association. So that's basically it from me. So I'll hand over to question time, really.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear about what's going on, and I look forward to being more involved too in reviewing what you've written, perhaps providing some feedback and seeing it implemented across the motu. So thanks very much. We've had a few questions, and the first one, I see that Lara's put her hand up. She wants to answer. The question is, what would be your top 2 tips to someone trying to incorporate climate-conscious lawyering into their practice? And this is a question that is especially for juniors, where we have less sway. Lara.
Well, I think probably Em and I both have lived experience of this. And for my part, what I'd say is skill yourself up. Have a look at the Law and Climate Atlas, engage in how the areas you're most interested in relate to climate change. Partners, and this advice is like for commercial firms, admittedly. So at my old law firm, partners are really busy, right? And so if you can go to them and say, hey, I saw this legal development, it relates to climate change in this way, I think clients would like to hear about it. Could I write a blog or some kind of a communication piece about this? They'd probably go, great. Free business development, like go forth and do that. If you do that enough times, you build a bit of a reputation internally as a bit of a go-to person on this topic, and that helps create that positive loop and feedback to engage with various partners across different sectors, because of course climate change doesn't affect just one area of law, it affects every area of law. So that would be one tip. The other would be to demonstrate the business case of it. We know that there is a significant business case for getting across this work. And in terms of what that looks like, again, go to the Atlas, look at examples and make that make sense for your New Zealand context. Em, anything else?
Only to echo that my way into developing a climate practice was to be that person who sent the updates about every climate litigation matter, every legal development that I came across that related to the issue. I think if you can take some ownership of the issue, it develops your knowledge base, but it does, as Lara mentioned, create your image as a bit of a go-to on this topic. So absolutely agree.
Thanks so much. Bryce has a question here. Are any of the panelists seeing an uptake in contract clauses that allow a party to terminate or renegotiate in favour of greener suppliers? And how are these tracking in terms of enforceability or commercial uptake globally, if so? And then following on from that, how far do you see that we as lawyers need to be going in identifying and advising on climate-related legal risks when these... Oh, this is the second question, actually. We'll go with the first one first about the clauses in relation to contracts and the ability to terminate or renegotiate in favour of greener suppliers.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you've heard of the Chancery Lane project, but it's a huge initiative that build out tons of model contract clauses for exactly this type of thing in a number of different sectors. For contracts that were signed many moons ago, that's a bit more difficult, and we see those, and we see a lot of disputes in areas of contracts in arbitration, for example, where the contract was not as favourable or where it didn't necessarily contemplate climate change being an issue. So we also see that play out. The Energy Charter Treaty is one example of that in Europe in particular. But I'll drop in the chat the Chancery Lane project model clauses. You can have a look at what they're saying best practice example is. They also have a number of case studies from firms, so you can see that applied in practice.
And we here in New Zealand have created some climate clause bank, a bank of climate clauses too, relating to finance side of things. But yeah, Chancery Lane project is a good one to look at. Em, do you have any experiences about these, about the termination and renegotiation in favour of greener suppliers, whether they're actually being used and how they're working?
Not specifically in practice, no. But again, yeah, Chancery Lane project's fantastic. So
It's a great place to go,
take a
isn't
look
it?
at that bank. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second question that Bryce has, and I want to add a little bit onto it actually too, is how far do you see that we as lawyers need to be going in identifying and advising on climate-related legal risks when these fall outside the explicit scope of instructions? This is such a practical and super interesting question, I think, and it goes back, I guess, to what you put in your terms of engagement. But I also think that we can often get real pushback from our clients or in-house, if we're in-house, about what issues are legal advice and what issues aren't legal advice. Aligned with this, though, is that question about whether we have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility, that is aligned with our obligation to uphold the rule of law to be bringing these sorts of issues in, which is something I like to investigate. But so I'm kind of hijacking Bryce's question. Let's go back to it. How far do you see that we as lawyers need to be going in identifying and advising on climate-related legal risks when these fall outside the explicit scope of instructions? We've got 3 minutes left, so hand it over to the two of you for a couple of minutes.
Start perhaps just to say that I think there is that important recognition that comes into it. And this goes to an earlier question that was asked by Hannah around, you know, the challenge being that climate change is a specialist and technical area. How can we be expected to sort of advise beyond what might be our expertise? And I think that there is a really important recognition that we don't need to all be experts on these issues, but we need to develop enough of an understanding that we can issue spot and then be able to say, oh, actually, I think perhaps you need to get technical advice on this particular point. Or I'd recommend getting separate advice on this point. And that's just speaking from my own personal experience in practice. I think it also does point to the importance of the retainer drafting and the framework for net zero alignment that Lara spoke to. I think, Lara, that contains specific provisions around the scope of retainer as well, I think.
Yes, lots of practical things around reviewable red lines. We're seeing some firms develop red line policies on accepting new matters, some for the hard to abate sector and some not. The appropriateness of lobbying by lawyers themselves in firms, how firms are responding both to their clients' needs, but also if they themselves have developed firm commitments and transition plans, how then that's informed by the work that they do for clients and being transparent around any policies adopted and, you know, classifications for different greenhouse gas transition tools. Basically, lawyers got together and said, what are the hardest things about being a lawyer and being a law firm to transition? How do we help our clients who are some legacy clients that we've had for decades that are in the hard to abate sector, while also keeping on track for net zero? So I did answer something similar in the chat. It's page 23 that has some of the most interesting parts. Have a look at the framework, have a read, and then email me. I've dropped my email in the chat. I hope if you had any clarifying questions, because certainly we're very open to them.
So many interesting questions. I think we could have a session just on, you know, the questions. That would be great. But it's 10 o'clock and it's time for us to stop and pull it all together. So there are some unanswered questions. We might have a think about what we can do with that and maybe get some of the information back out. But I want to just wind up by saying thank you so much to all of our speakers. Thank you to Emily, to Lara and Bronwyn particularly for addressing an important kaupapa for us here in the legal profession here in New Zealand. You know, throughout the world, there are so many questions for lawyers who are wanting to be climate conscious in their practice. And at the moment, you know, Jess started by talking about how maybe there was less of an interest in this given the turbulent times that we're in, but you have each provided some real encouragement and enthusiasm when frankly we needed it. So I want to say thank you to all of you. It's been a brilliant start to the day, and perhaps we will meet again. To the attendees, thanks for being here and for expressing interest in such a vital topic. We'll be emailing you confirmation of your attendance. Cheers.